Hello students, welcome to Drishti IAS. COP30 is happening in Brazil and an independent think tank's report highlights that the situation of global climate funding is very disappointing at the moment. So in this video, let us look at what the report says and what kinds of funds are these vulnerable countries across the globe receiving from the multilateral climate funds. So this report has been published by Adaptation, which is an independent think tank in Europe, and the report is titled The Nexus of Adaptation and Health Finance, Mapping Multilateral Climate Funds. Now please note that this report only focuses on multilateral climate funds like the Green Climate Fund. It does not take into consideration any bilateral contributions that would have been made from one country to another or any private sector contributions as well. It only focuses on multilateral climate funds because these are the major source of global climate funding. And the report highlights that there are serious gaps in the global climate funding. So by now we know that one of the severe ill effects of climate change is witnessed by the health systems. Now, in order to deal with climate change, we need to build what? We need to build climate resilient health systems, and for that we need money, and that money is going to come in from the multilateral climate funds, and particularly the vulnerable countries. Vulnerable countries are the countries that are most at risk. So these vulnerable countries like the least developed countries or the small island developing states, they require more money to deal with climate change. But the report says that they are not getting as much as they need. But if we talk about the figure specifically, only 0.5% of all multilateral climate funding, which is approximately $173 million since 2004, has been allocated to support health systems in the vulnerable countries. Versus what did they ask for? Under their national adaptation plans, they asked for $2.54 billion, and they got how much? $173 million. So there is a huge gap. There's a huge mismatch between what is needed and what they actually received. Now let us understand the whole story of climate change in order to see where this fits in. So when we talk about climate change, there are two things that we need to deal with it. First is mitigation, and second is adaptation. Both are equally important to deal with climate change. Now under mitigation, we focus on reducing the causes of climate change. So we identify that climate change is happening, global warming is happening, temperatures are rising. But why are they rising? They are rising because GHG emissions are rising. So under mitigation, we focus on reducing the cause of climate change. So under this, we are going to focus on our emission cuts. And what else? Our renewable energy targets. So we are basically focusing on what needs to be done in the present so as to mitigate these things from happening in the future. This is taken care of under mitigation. And in adaptation, we acknowledge the situation, we understand that climate change is happening, global warming is happening, temperatures are rising, and under adaptation we are going to focus on what needs to be done in the present in order to learn to live with this changing environment. How do we adapt to our changing environment in the present? This is taken care of in the adaptation measures. Now mitigation basically came in from the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement was COP21, and adaptation came in from the Cancun Summit, and this was COP16. Now under Paris Agreement, under these mitigation efforts, these countries, they basically send in what? Their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and these are nothing but the targets that the countries set for themselves so as to mitigate the causes of global warming or climate change. And under adaptation, we have the Cancun Adaptation Framework, and under this we send in our National Adaptation Plans or NAPs. And these national adaptation plans are long-term documents which basically focus on what the emission situation in the country looks like, which sectors are the most affected, which are the most vulnerable groups of the country that are most affected. We identify all these things and then we decide a framework for ourselves. An adaptation plan is defined under the national adaptation plans, and this is sent under the adaptation efforts. And under mitigation, we have the nationally determined contributions. Now in adaptation only we have the Green Climate Fund. This is a major multilateral climate fund which basically focuses on financing the vulnerable countries. I already told you vulnerable countries like the LDCs, SIDS or any other coastal areas, etc. So Green Climate Fund is majorly focused on financing the climate needs of these vulnerable countries like the least developed countries or small island developing states, and this comes under the adaptation framework. In fact, COP30 also is being called an adaptation summit, because here our major target or major focus is on adaptation measures versus all the other earlier summits majorly used to focus on mitigation efforts. This one is majorly focusing on adaptation efforts. That is why this itself becomes important. Now if we talk about the climate funding situation of these vulnerable countries, so most of the climate fund they receive is from the Green Climate Fund. 70% of the fund that they receive is from the Green Climate Fund, and this Green Climate Fund is basically funding like 66% or 2/3 of this fund is going to the East Asia and Pacific region. 2/3 is going to East Asia and Pacific, and 25% is going to the Sub-Saharan Africa. Great. The problem but lies in South Asia, funding South Asia. South Asia, which includes countries like India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. South Asia is receiving 0 health specific adaptation projects through these multilateral funds. So East Asia and Pacific is also getting something, Sub-Saharan Africa is also getting something, but South Asia is getting 0 at the moment. And this area is going to deal with 18% of the future climate health issues. So we are going to face 18% of the future climate health issues, and what are we getting to deal with those things? We are getting 0 at the moment. There is a huge mismatch in the South Asian region, and other fragile and conflict affected states are also not in a great position. They are also receiving only 4% at the moment. Now the problem here is that please recall that GCF majorly was made to fund whom? The vulnerable countries like your LDCs, vulnerable countries like these conflict areas, these fragile areas. But is the funding actually happening? Is it funding these areas? It is not. The fund is majorly going to East Asia and Pacific region, which is more developed when it comes to South Asia or the fragile or conflict affected areas, whereas the fund should have gone to these areas. But this is not happening. All that is only on paper. This is not happening in real life. So this is where the situation is. This is where the problem lies at the moment, that these areas are not receiving as much fund as they need to build the climate resilient health systems. So now in order to deal with these things, what do we need to do? A, we need to acknowledge that these funds, the core principle of GCF was to fund the vulnerable countries. So we need to acknowledge that, and we need to start diverting our funds to the vulnerable countries. And one possible apprehension that these donor countries might have in funding the vulnerable countries could be that, these areas do not have a stable government or a stable administrative setup or a proper paperwork framework. So maybe reporting and monitoring can be a challenge over here. So they might not want to spend their money in these areas. But this is a problematic situation. These areas need that money. So the money needs to go in there, and a proper administrative framework should be decided. A proper paperwork should be set up for these things so that reporting can happen, financing can happen, and ultimately these vulnerable sections can deal with the ill effects of climate change. And we also need to work on something which is climate justice. Because the developing nations or the least developed countries at the moment are dealing with the harmful effects or are paying the price of all the destruction that has been caused by the developed nations during their industrialization phase. They caused all the global warming, they caused all the climate change, and we at the moment are not getting enough funds to transition to green technology. This is a major challenge that all these countries, these developing nations, these least developed countries are facing at the moment. So we need to understand the principle of climate justice, and we need to start providing funds to these nations so that they can invest in R&D, they can invest in innovation, and they can ultimately transition to green technology, to clean technology, and work on building climate resilient health systems. So this is what needs to be done at the moment. That was all for today's video. I hope you understood everything that we discussed here, that this report tells us that the situation of global climate financing at the moment is very grim, because these vulnerable countries are not getting as much as they need, but they need to do that. But these countries, they need all this money in order to deal with climate change. So that was all. Now, as always, let us look at a practice question for prelims. Consider the following statements regarding climate adaptation finance and health systems. 1. The Green Climate Fund is the primary multilateral source of funding for climate-related health adaptation projects. 2. South Asia currently receives the largest share of multilateral climate finance for health system adaptation due to its high vulnerability. 3. Fragile and conflict-affected states receive less than 5% of climate adaptation finance for strengthening health systems. Which of the statements given above is or are not correct? A, 2 only, B, 1, 2 and 3 only, C, 2 and 3 only, or D, 3 only. Please attempt this question and provide your answers in the comment section. Thank you for watching.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.